World Affairs Council. I'd like to welcome all of you. This is our fall lecture series on understanding Muslim societies. If you don't have a brochure yet, please feel free to pick one up. Tonight's event is a national program of the World Affairs Councils of America, with support provided by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Our Western Michigan Council received a grant to host tonight's speaker as well as to webcast this program to all of the 100 World Affairs Councils in the nation tonight. So, greetings to our national World Affairs audience, and greetings to those watching by webcast tonight by one of our educational partners, Ferris State in Big Rapids. Hi. We're all going to turn around and wave. We hope that all of our webcast guests will feel free to participate in the question and answer time by texting us your questions. And the text number for those of you on the website, on the webcast, is on the National Council's website. And we checked and it's the right number, because trust me, that's happened before. It's been the wrong number. It is the right number. And greetings to our live audience. We're glad that you're here, and we hope that you will be able to join us tonight after the lecture for a reception with our special guest. Ambassador Tahir Keeley was the first Muslim ambassador of the United States, and she was appointed by the first President Bush. She later served under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice as her senior advisor for women's empowerment. You also have a more extensive biography in your program. Tonight, the ambassador will begin by speaking on the importance of engaging Americans on understanding Muslim societies, and then she will specifically address the role women play within Muslim societies. So please join me in welcoming Madam Ambassador.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I am very delighted to be here on this subject, which I think is of extreme importance. And when I received this invitation some months back, it was not only exciting because I've never been to Michigan, so that was nice, but also because I thought, the fact that there is interest in an issue that I think has remained on the forefront for the last decade plus. It sort of is important. It is something that I look forward to very much in our interaction with the audience here, with the national audience, through your questions and your comments and answers. It is, however, a very large subject, and I did something I don't normally do because, as Dr. Rice used to say, we're academics, we know how to talk, so go out there and talk. But on this issue, I thought you're compressing into a short period of time an enormously complicated subject. It's not only complicated in historical context, but even more so in how we think and act today in this very globalized world in which we live, where geography is no longer a barrier to understanding. So as a Muslim, as a female, as an American, as in any of those combinations, to sort of hold forth on this issue, and I'm sure many of you are much more knowledgeable on the issue of the theology aspects of this than certainly am I. But nonetheless, being a Muslim means something very specific to me. And I thought I would attempt to address using this wonderful invitation as an excuse. The context in which one has to sort of begin to look at how do we understand Muslim societies, and we here I mean Americans, it becomes even more paramount because I think that given that there are over 1.75 billion Muslims who reside in 49 countries covering all parts of the world, Islam is the world's second largest religion after Christianity. 25% of the world's population is Muslim, and Islam is said to be the world's fastest growing religion. So I thought that given my own professional and personal experience, that I would address the issue in terms of Muslims in nation states and as non-actors. I want to focus on why it even matters that we in the US should care about Muslim societies. What are the factors we might do something to influence? What elements do we have little or no control over? And finally, what are some of the implications for US foreign policy? Let me start at a personal level. When I first came to the US at the age of 15 from Pakistan, I was born in India, grew up in Pakistan. I came to go to university, Ohio Wesleyan. My religion was hardly an issue in 1959, though I was aware that I was one of only 2 foreign students, the other being a German girl in Delaware, Ohio. But there was interest in my background, in the life lived before arrival in the US, and I was invited into homes, churches, schools, Rotary clubs, etc., to talk about Pakistan and found responsive audiences. Delaware, Ohio was a small and is a small town in the Midwest, but I found people with big hearts and warm hospitality. Despite what I assumed was a sophisticated beginning, from Peshawar to the US, there were moments of comedy for a young 15-year-old Muslim girl who became a junior and graduated at 16 from university. I looked older, and my roommate, I remember, was ever annoyed when she was asked to show her ID if we ever went out in the evening, and I was not. Whenever she protested, the usual response, pointing to me, was, "She looks fine." Some years later, after my return to Pakistan, after my BA, my marriage, and then moved back to the US with my husband, who was a postdoctoral fellow in physics at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, my career path led me in a different direction. I served on the faculty of the US Army War College, where I was told that I was the first female Muslim to ever have joined its ranks. In 1980, right on the heels of the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the takeover by Ayatollahs, the religious elite, the takeover of that strategic country, and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, interest in Muslim societies had begun to accelerate. My time at the Strategic Studies Institute in Carlisle, where I worked with the Pentagon on the establishment of the Central Command, was a learning experience par excellence for me. But it was sort of an interesting mix because I was on the faculty at Temple University in Philadelphia, but it was a different world to be in a place where the aspiring stars, the 2 stars would go to before they became 3 stars and so on. America's focus on the Cold War had meant engagement with the Muslim world. There were friends and perceived neutrals and even foes in that war, but it was always in terms of what a nation as a state actor was doing or not doing in order to help US promote its interest. The policy focus remained the ruling elites and governments. Even as the US gave economic assistance, the goal of which was the development of various countries' economic progress, the governments in respective countries got to decide the priorities and the pace of economic assistance within the allocated amount. Thus, throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, US foreign policy sought friends in the Muslim world, encouraged people-to-people contact through academic exchanges, student exchanges, trade assistance, but at the policy level, Muslim societies were not a major focus. The academic world had its experts. You had Professor, for example, Fazlur Rahman at the University of Chicago and Bernard Lewis at Princeton University. Being a Muslim in America at many levels was still unique. For example, when I was sworn in as U.S. Ambassador by Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger in July 1990, going on to represent the U.S. at the United Nations, it was the protocol people at the State Department who got very excited and told me that I was the first Muslim, male or female, in U.S. history to become an American ambassador. I was very proud, I was very honored, but it just didn't quite resonate that this was quite the exceptional thing that later it would appear to be. During my service at the National Security Council of the White House from 1984 to 1990, I heard about the unique situation I was in and felt proud and privileged by the honor. In any case, there were not too many women in the White House serving in key positions at the time in 1984, certainly none who looked like me. And I used to joke in the early months of my appointment that President Reagan might think that I'd been left behind by a visiting delegation to the Oval Office. One day after a meeting, the president asked me to stay a minute, took me aside, and noted, and I think Colin Powell was in the room with us, that Shireen, I know who you are, and no, I do not think you were left behind. The word gets back. I note the above not only to give you a window into my own experience, but also to point out that that unique was an acceptable term in those years. America as a nation had not had any traumatic, negative personal experience at Muslim hands, and so its psyche was largely yet untouched. September 9th, 2001 changed all that dramatically. The how and the why of that awful act of terror against the homeland forced a laser-like focus on Muslim societies. The prevailing question was, as asked by Dr. Condoleezza Rice and others so often that I heard after my return to the White House in 2003, what led the terrorist hijackers of the three flights that hit the World Trade Towers, the Pentagon, and that took the plane crashing into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, to spend their life plotting and led to their giving their life for destruction rather than building a productive life for themselves and for others? It was a difficult question. I mean, it seems like some by-the-way comment, but it really wasn't. I mean, this was new, this was different, and how do you cope with this switch of mentality, and especially coming as it did from non-state actors? So the focus in so many ways was traumatizing. As the global war on terror got going, peeling off Muslim societies from the clutches of the terrorists and their leading proponents such as the Al-Qaeda came into sharp relief. Also, at the same time, the often negative and strange commentary about Muslims became central to the political discourse. Past close cooperation between the United States and many Muslim countries was often forgotten by both sides as the turmoil of post-9/11 got underway. Thereafter, one began to hear increasingly generalized statements about the nature of Islam, Muslim societies, and the us versus them approach that came to symbolize so much of the discourse. For example, as Professor Sharifa Zahoor catalogs in her very interesting monograph, Precision in the Global War on Terror, Inciting Muslims to the War of Ideas, a number of common themes emerged during this period, which I want to recite below to give you a sense of the scope and depth of criticism of Muslims and Muslim societies in today's America. First, as part of the attempt to reshape the Muslim world, all types of Islamists are treated as militant fundamentalists, linking distinct aspects of Islamic thought to terrorism. Second, as the excellent essay by Vartan Gregorian details, Islam is a mosaic, not a monolith. Islam covers 49 countries in various parts of the world. While the source of the religion, the Quran, is shared throughout the Muslim world in terms of its formal religion, Muslims live their lives differently in different places to a great extent. History, divisions, for example, the divisions between Shias and Sunnis, culture, etc., all have a bearing on the population. But the media tends to lump all Muslims together. Policy communities find it easier to deal with a comprehensive model in this fashion. Third, as Mahmoud Mamdani's treatise, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim denotes, often the key division among radical Islamist intellectuals concerns the status of Sharia, Islamic law, which some say needs to take into account changing, evolving circumstances with capacity for interpretation, and others note that the gates of ijtihad remain forever closed. That tension often gets reflected in the dire forecast by political elites, even in the US in recent years, that Muslims of America are simply waiting to push for Sharia law across the US. There are even websites and organizations that ask for and spend funds and lead political campaigns on what, to my mind, is a bogus issue. This is the Islamofascism charge that links Muslims with the imposition of Sharia and the establishment of a caliphate within the United States. Most Muslims find the berating of their faith for supposed fascist tendencies both untrue and deeply insulting. Fourth, as a particular version of the jihadist ideology has become well known, we speak of global jihad to denote a strategic discovery aimed at protecting us from future attacks. In the process, we lump a large number of Muslims into the category of potential enemies of the West. Fifth, the overarching concept, militant Islamists, fails to cover the wide diversity of causes for the militancy. The broad brushstroke identifies the absence of democracy as a root cause for extremism and fashions U.S. foreign policy in favor of democracy promotion in the Muslim world. Sixth, unlike with other major religions, only Muslims are told that there are good Muslims and bad Muslims. Further, criticism is based on select cultural, religious, and intellectual principles. This is a concept characterized as theologocentrism, attributed to all observable phenomena among Muslims to matters of Islamic ideology. Seventh, there are secular instincts and believers in the Muslim world who are often put on the defensive even as they disagree amongst themselves about religiosity, cultural differences, and the best path forward. The West does not often recognize that some Islamists are simply chasing political power, and while others are not. Eighth, Westerners assume that the clergy play exactly the same role in the Muslim world as they do in Christianity, which is not the case. No clergy stands between the believer and God in Islam. Mullahs, often uneducated, are self-appointed guardians. The above list is far from comprehensive, but I wanted to illustrate the language of disagreement that often defines the parameters of understanding. Next, I want to focus on why understanding Muslim societies matters. At so many levels, how we interact with those people and states that are different is essential in this very interdependent world. U.S. interests are global in economic, strategic, and political diplomatic terms. In an era where military might must be enhanced through collaboration, we cannot spend insufficient numbers to take on the onus of our global agenda unilaterally. Building strength through support is critical. This is why so many American programs have looked at and tried to build relationships with Muslim countries. In the past, that support for U.S. priorities was sought from regimes and rulers. Today, there is greater possibility of helping build bridges to civil society through the use of what is now termed smart power. However, reaching out to the Muslim world means, first and foremost, that we respect each other's history and religion. We need to be cognizant of past achievements, even as we criticize current practices. Muslim societies have had many achievements and led the world at another time in a number of areas. Let me just elucidate on some of these. I learned of the attitude of Islam and towards science from my father, Dr. Raziuddin Siddiqui. He was educated in the traditional schools of Hyderabad, India, where I was born, but also went on to Cambridge University in the UK, to academic institutions in France, and received his PhD in mathematical physics from the University of Leipzig, where he studied with the stars of the era, Heisenberg, Einstein, Dirac. He spoke 6 languages, 3 Eastern, 3 Westerns, fluently. His work and treatise on thermal dynamics won him international acclaim and a nomination for the Nobel Prize. He received the Nehru Gold Medal for Science in India and innumerable other awards at home and abroad for his life's work. My father taught me that one of the great achievements of history was Islam's attitude towards learning. That is the universal right to knowledge. In this era of compulsory and free education and the recognition of fundamental human rights, people are apt to forget that for a long time in human history, learning was considered to be the exclusive privilege of a certain restricted class. This was the class of religious leaders. Islam changed all this by abolishing priesthood and making it obligatory on all believers to acquire knowledge for themselves. This may not seem such a big deal now, but the democratization of knowledge with the consequent liberation of the human spirit was a great revolution in human affairs. In the very first verse of the Quran revealed to him, the Prophet of Islam was directed to read. The importance on reading, writing, and acquiring knowledge has been expounded in the verse in a most forceful way, pressing for its acquisition even if one had to go to distant places in search of it. Islam thus sanctified knowledge. Further, there are orders in the Quran and the Hadith that call for the education of both men and women, noting, the acquisition of knowledge is the duty of every male and female believer. Islam's attitude towards the scientific method is also a contribution worth noting. In the early days of civilization, man was used to taking things at face value. As time passed and consciousness developed, he acquired knowledge by experience. His knowledge consisted of a catalog of events. He was not yet at a point of drawing inferences or making predictions. Greek philosophers attached importance to reason, thinking, but downplayed observation at that time. The Quran appealed to reason and experience and lays stress on travel, observation, and contemplation. Observe what is in the heaven and earth. Do you not think? Do you not contemplate? The Islamic origins of the scientific method are now recognized by many Western historians, such as Briffaut, Bacon, and others. They note that in Islam there is no asceticism and people are encouraged to use all resources for the betterment of humankind and in pursuit of knowledge. The work of scholars such as George Sarton in bringing into focus the achievements of Muslims in various branches of knowledge throughout the Middle Ages is known. The Arabs started to work on arithmetic in the 8th century. Their first task was to systematize the use of numerals now permanently associated with their name. The zero was mentioned for the first time in the arithmetic work of Al-Khwarizmi in the 9th century. Arabs contributed greatly to rational numbers consisting of fractions, developed various types of numbers, developed the science of algebra. From Genghis Khan to Mughal emperors, support for astronomy also led to discoveries and the developments of instruments that contributed mightily to human knowledge and understanding. It is a history that Muslims are rightly proud of and non-Muslims appreciate. I have given you a small taste of these achievements over these many centuries. There is also a huge contribution made over more recent centuries in the arts, literature, and architecture. Of course, post-industrial revolution, as the West sprang into progress, the Muslim world was left far behind. Yet these lands did contribute to overall successes of the Western world. Colonialism was a vehicle which required conquest and occupation of so many parts of the Muslim world, which sustained the colonial masters. The history of the interaction between the West and the Islamic worlds may well have been entirely different absent colonial empires. Given that US history has had nothing to do with colonial conquest, Americans are often puzzled at the vehemence of populations in Muslim countries' feelings against the US. As the Pew Research polls have indicated, in the last decades, the positive feelings of Muslims in a variety of countries towards the US have declined steadily. Is that result of religion, history, culture, educational ignorance? My own sense is that post-World War II history has a large share in negative feelings about the US. Many feel that the US is now a colonial power where foreign wars and subsequent occupation, however limited in duration. And this has, I think, complicated US interaction with the Muslim world. The growth of what is termed the non-state actor as a force in international politics has also complicated understanding and prevented positive links with the Muslim world for the US. After 9/11, the role of groups such as Al-Qaeda with tentacles in so many parts of the Muslim world made their demise the first priority of American policy. In order to defeat this enemy, outside powers have had to expend a great deal of blood and treasure, while the indigenous groups receive support from the population whose cooperation they must have in order to hide and threaten the West. This is not simply the Huntington noted clash of civilization. I believe it is a fundamental shift in the definition of civilization itself. This is not the nation state which provides the underpinning of modern diplomacy. This is a group of people wanting to take the world back to the Middle Ages. They do not have the support of the majority of citizens in the states in which they operate, yet they threaten to turn the silent majority that is against their method into a silent minority. The recent start of what is termed as the Arab Spring, with the overthrow of dictatorial regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and beyond, was greeted with great relief because it implied a different and more participatory future for the people of these lands. American leaders noted that no single day or event can instill democracy in a hurry, but people themselves were now demanding the end of self-serving regimes and asking for access to benefits long denied them. Armed with little more than their determination, they fought at great cost for their rights. Women stood shoulder to shoulder with men to fight for a better future, as they have had indeed had to do in the early days of Islam. In the recent months, they have used new technologies of social media to outmaneuver the armies. They paid a price in blood, but demanded a radical change. For many Americans, the daily sights and excited commentary from the countries in turmoil in the Muslim world has sparked excitement, but also fear. How can one be sure of a future with positive alliances? Who will be the next target of wrath from the people? How can the U.S. interest in strategic terms be protected around the world as known regimes fall and an uncertain future comes into focus? These are the crucial questions that many a U.S. official is seized with and wading through a lot of information to find the right answer. For the rest of us, we need to understand that history does not stand still, that diversity in the Muslim world is a better guarantor of a range of opinion, that there are many there who want a future where the citizen has access to basic needs such as housing, food, education, and minimum wages. Of course, within this world, and this is not just in the Muslim world, women comprise 50% of the population. And I do believe that particularly in the Muslim world, they are especially keen to see a future where their daughters, along with their sons, have a better life than that which they have lived. You remember the plight of girls who have increasingly become targets of extremists, and there has had to be universal commitment to persist in providing education. The recent case of Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan, who was shot by the Taliban for the simple fact that she demanded to be educated, has lit international desire to help. I really do hope that good things can come from bad acts, and this could be the one spark that leads to a commitment particularly for the education of girls. Often it has been culture that has determined the poor treatment of women in the Muslim world. Though justified on religious grounds by mostly uneducated males and mullahs, the tribal cultural norms push people into situations where women are kept isolated and uneducated. As the Arab Human Development Report documented a decade ago, in the study of women in Arab countries, the denial of equal access to education and the subsequent absence of women from productive participation in society has helped keep these countries behind despite their vast oil wealth. There is nothing Islamic about women as uneducated non-participants in their respective Muslim countries. This is part of the extremist ideology perpetuated through terror, as the Malala assassination attempt demonstrated. As I mentioned, the Islam that I know has exhorted its followers to enable both men and women to strive for knowledge. It has called upon males and females to do good work and to reap the rewards equally. The Quran admonished as evildoers the perpetrators of the practice whereby girls were buried at birth. There are a number of orders in the Quran and the Hadith that call for the education of both men and women, as I said earlier, noting that the acquisition of knowledge is the duty of every male and female believer. But I think that it is also a function of our times that in political discourse, be it in far distant lands and the Arab world or other Muslim countries, or be it in America in an election cycle, somehow it becomes fair game to go after women's issues, often in a very negative light. And the language that is sometimes used is really quite discouraging. Further, of course, in terms of the Muslim world, demographics, of course, is a factor. Where 40% of the population is below the age of 30, pressure for education, jobs, and survival becomes paramount. It took the frustration of a street vendor who had had it with the security establishment of his country to light a match to end his own life. He died, but the spark resulted in a change of regime in Tunisia and spread far beyond. Muslims themselves, I believe, have to decide what sort of future they want. Do they want Islamic utopia? Do they want to be open to the world? They want democracy? The majority of Muslims condemn terrorism. More Muslims have died in Muslim countries as a result of terrorism, violence perpetrated by Muslims against Muslims. So one has to believe that there is some soul searching that takes place. In the end, I do believe that we need to be mindful of change, even if we do not always understand it. We need to ensure that these United States, built with the help and participation of so many religions and ethnic minorities, remains a beacon to all immigrants, and it stays studiously away from scapegoating Muslims living in our midst. Remember, as noted by Clinton Bennett, that in certain ways Muslims are the same everywhere, yet their societies are different everywhere. Some countries in the Muslim world, such as Turkey, chose a secular path. But secularization does not necessarily result in decline of religion. Islam is still, after all, the personal compass for 99% of Turks. So the questions are many, the answers, I just wanted to sort of highlight some framework within which we can discuss things. I thank you again for being here, and I'm delighted to respond to any questions that you might have, or your national audience from the. Thank you. There's a microphone back there for Amy's going to be the keeper.
For questions tonight, please make sure everyone speaks into the microphone so that our national audience can hear.
Madam Ambassador, you referred in a hopeful way to the reaction in Pakistan to the attempted assassination of the schoolgirl who is an advocate for girls' education. Why is this different from the reaction to earlier acts of terrorism, the killing of Shahbaz Bhatti, whom I knew, the Minister for Minorities Affairs, and the senior official in the Punjab? And why do you see this as hopeful?
You know, it's a very good question. Why is this different from earlier heinous acts? And maybe because things have gotten so bad that one begins to look for silver linings when they occur. And I think people were dismayed when Salman Taseer was killed. They were very dismayed when Minister Bhatti was killed, for all the right reasons. But the opinion was divided. I thought it was awful the way the keepers of the law, the lawyers of a country, were running around just sort of throwing flowers on the guy who did the killing of Salman Taseer, and others who did similar despicable acts after the other minister's death. Perhaps because this was a young girl, this was a daughter of the nation. I mean, somehow it sparked in people's humanity, and one has to believe there is humanity there, something that was sort of crossed the line. I mean, that's the word that one kept hearing, that this will cross the line. I would have thought that people have felt that way long before, because the lines have been crossed over many a year, actually. But this one, because what she was asking for was so fundamental. She was not saying stop corruption or do something with somebody else. She was just simply saying, I have a right to speak, I have a right to be educated, and I demand that right, and I will make, and clearly this was a rising star, because she was extraordinarily bright and focused, considering where she grew up. I mean, she came from the northern areas, Swat. And so I think it resonated in a way, and I was very, very surprised and extremely happy that it seemed to cut across religious parties and different party lines until, of course, finally the sort of ether began to descend again, and some people began to make excuses. This is, I mean, the tendency for that people look for rather than trying to fix a problem, that the paranoia that no, this is a plot to just show us up as being not up to standard, etc. But I thought it was a more united, it was a national reaction, and it has been longer lived, and it cut across all the institutional lines, which I had not seen before. You didn't get from the politicians to the military to the security services a sort of this is enough kind of a response. And the fact that the Taliban, even though they were sort of playing their usual ignorant macho stuff, got a bit nervous, sort of after a while, and began to sort of threaten the reporters who were reporting on this issue as having played heavily in Pakistan. That they had never done before, because they felt they could do anything with impunity. So their nervousness gave me a little more hope, saying maybe this has something more, and that it's not occurred in a void. It is happened on a series of other things, and this was just the tipping of the balance. All those other acts were terrible, but this may be the one that gets people to just search their souls and do something.
Madam Ambassador, we see a lot in the news here of, I guess you could say, riots and other areas of violence when the Quran is disparaged. We don't see that when other religions have the same, some against Judaism or anything. We see it when people speak against the Quran. Could you please address that as we see such reaction to that?
You're talking about you don't see it when similar acts occur in the Muslim world?
No. When other religions are treated the same way.
Where?
If somebody says something against the Christian religion, we don't see the uprisings and the violence as we do when somebody says something against the Muslim religion, at least when the West says it.
Oh, not that somebody in the Muslim world says something like, well, I suppose the simple answer is, well, they figure that that's their business. The West says something against their prominent religion. Okay, they have a right. Similarly, of course, I don't know that it's comparable, but I think that the sort of the anger reflected in the very strong reaction, I mean, seen some pretty horrific things, have been, it's a combination of paranoia, a sense of they're mocking us, plus this, this is that the Quran stands for something that Muslims, I mean, that that's where it's all at, and the people who are mocking it or burning it or by design or by mistake do injustice. There's a disproportionality because of the focus, I think. And the hurt is genuine, and I think it's widespread. I mean, when whatever this film was that nobody required me, thank goodness I left all my jobs, I didn't have to go watch it, was made, you don't get these kinds of things too often made against other religions. Right now, it's, as somebody said to me, you know, the only politically correct thing left anymore is to be anti-Muslim. And to some extent, it's true. I can say that I've never had any, I mean, I told you about my early years in America, but even in and I've been here now since 1959, that's much of my life. I have not personally, even in these days, had anything to gripe about, so it doesn't come from that. But I do notice in the dialogue, and people will say, no, we don't mean you. And I say, why don't you mean me? You should mean me, because I know more people like me in my religion than like the ones that you're talking about. So, you know, it's sort of you make a caricature out of what you don't understand. And because of 9/11, I think a lot of people felt they had a license to go the extra mile to do that. Because after all, Muslims are all savages, they can't understand anything, and so on. And of course, the fact that the Taliban and the mullahs are literally uneducated types with controls over people's minds, even Muslims find it hard to sort of beat down on that. The frustration in trying to deal with that within the system is even greater than that by trying to impose it from outside. Nobody's found the magic switch yet. And I don't know, I hope they find it in my lifetime, but I don't know. Ma'am, you're over here in the green dress. Ah. Okay, afterwards.
Yes, thank you for your comments. In your enumerated list of differences in viewpoint between the West and the Muslim world, I think you said something about a view of good Muslims versus bad Muslims. And I don't know if you were attributing that to the West. But in any event, I wonder if you could explain that. Were you simply suggesting that that's too simplistic a view, or that, in fact, there are no bad Muslims? Because evil does exist throughout the world.
Oh, yeah.
In all cultures, to some extent, of course.
Very good point. Of course. My point was exactly that their evil exists everywhere. But you don't hear too much about any other kind of good versus bad in any religion, except good Muslim versus bad Muslim. And that sort of marginalizes what we consider the good Muslim, in fact. So that one ought to be careful in labeling, because there's good and bad everywhere. And it's wrong to speak about it in those terms, as far as I'm concerned, in any religion. So that was the point I was making. The lady in the second row, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your speech. I really enjoyed it a lot. Two questions. Is the role of women in the Islamic world changing a lot? And how do you see that changing very much in the future? The other thing I'm curious about is the recent treaty that was passed in the Philippines between the Muslims in Mindanao and the Filipino government. What kind of an effect is that going to have down the road? Is that really important, or would you speak to that a little bit?
The second one, I'm not knowledgeable enough to really speak to it apropos of the agreement in the Philippines. It's a very important question, and somebody with an understanding of the history of the context of the agreement is better able to address it than mine would be. Yes, of course, everything it's a positive development, everybody says, because it makes the nation more inclusive. But what does this mean down the road, which is your question, which I'm unfortunately don't feel qualified to, because I don't know much about the Philippines in that context. But the role of women, yes, it is changing, and it is very interesting how it is changing. I mean, some of it is because it's been targeted with assistance. the bad guys burn girls' schools, but the good guys build more. The interesting thing is there was a point where some of these sort of the fathers of girls were even uneducated fathers of girls, wanted to send, and very often still want to send their daughters to school, provided it is not, after a certain age, a co-ed school. So I think that the recognition that an educated girl is not only important because she has a right to be educated, but also because as a mother, a future mother, when she has a capacity to influence a larger segment of the family. There used to be a phrase, and I was discussing it in terms of the Baha'i faith, that how given an option, that's why it's such I think an enlightened group of people, because the mothers are the sort of the conveyor belt of a few educated family. But in South Asia, there used to be a saying that you teach a man how to read, and it's just the man who learns to read. You teach a woman how to read, and there are some 19 people who learn to read. It's a very powerful thing. It's a simple phrase. And I remember when somebody said this, and I said, how do you know? And they actually have worked through this in terms of large families, joint families. In the well-to-do families, the mother will then, of course, it's the daughters, it's the people who work for them. It's not just the girls who are there, but the boys when they are little. So, it's I think, and that sort of, in a trickle, in a very small way, it gets through. I think the targeted development assistance from outside is making a difference in some countries. I wish, my latest sort of soapbox has been that we actually ought to stop military assistance because it doesn't make any difference anyway. We're not to give whatever assistance one is giving for education, particularly girls' education. You want to help make moderate Muslim societies, why don't we just give the girls the education that will help? It's not a very popular, you'd be surprised how unpopular it is even in our own country, because then what happens to the Pentagon's links and what happens to the security forces and I've been there, done that. So but I still think it's a very good investment for us. The other thing that's very different now from way back, the diaspora from various countries. Not just South Asians, but others, they have understood the American concept of giving back. Philanthropy used to be a marginal thing for this group of, they're well educated, they're well employed, and they are well-to-do. Now they are giving back to the countries they came from for education in particular, and girls' education in particular. So using local non-governmental organizations, they are supporting the building of schools, overseeing education, including up north. I know this a little bit because I travel to some of these. And, the next phase would be if one could do education and health for girls or women. That would be, of course, a winning strategy, but that's still a ways away. So it's just, I think, so there are some plus signs. And I think the reason this has become such a confrontation in the Muslim world, and particularly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc., right now, which are on the front lines, is because I just call them the uneducated mullahs. They feel threatened because suddenly their daughters want, they've always sort of been conservative, but they've had certain freedoms within that for education, for being teachers or doctors. Those are the only two professions normally open in conservative societies. But never mind that. Even in the well-to-do societies of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, they've got the wherewithal, and for a while you can buy people off, or you can say, well, why would you want to drive when you can have a driver? There are days when I wish I had one. But that's not the point. The point is that, if a woman has a place to drive to, it's not just running to the nearest shopping mall, each of which is more extravagant than the next one. But it's what do they do when they get there? And and women are beginning to demand it. So you can muzzle them for a while, you can, but, given that 50% of the population remains female, I think I feel that this is changing, and it's going to change through education. And it's going to come in combination of collaborative efforts, including civil society and governments.
We have a question from Ferris State University. They're watching via webcast.
Yes, of course.
Ferris, somebody from Ferris texted in. They asked, other than education, what do you think, other than education, what are some other areas of discrimination that women, Muslim women face? And then maybe if you could expand a little bit to talk about maybe what discriminations you have faced being a Muslim woman.
I think the second part of the question is, as I was saying, I stand before you not as a woman who's been sat upon, so I can't say that I've personally, at the personal level, I think every now and again people get a little bit of a surprise because I'm outside the traditional national security mold. I mean, for example, at the Army War College, I remember because it was a different thing. It wasn't discrimination, it was just the shock factor. Because I remember going into a briefing in the auditorium, which was this very plush place, and there was a Marine at the door checking everybody's security clearances, and I had the requisite high security clearance, so I went in. And the college used to also have colonels and brigadier generals from about 15 or 16 friendly countries who came there for the course for the year, and some of them brought their spouses with them. And I remember as the lights were going down, the visiting 3-star from the Pentagon said, he looked around, and there were only about 18 of us in this room, and saw me, only female, obviously not typical looking for Army War College, and said, do you have a security clearance? And of course, Carlisle is a very chivalrous place, so I felt all my friends and the commandant of the begin to feel very nervous and get edgy, and so I said, yes. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry, I thought you were somebody's wife. So I said to him, I am. So, we went on, and afterwards he came over, he was so apologetic, and I thought, I could either make a fuss and make him feel miserable, or I could just say, look, when you shatter barriers and you're a first, and that's the reason I tend to be optimistic. I would have probably keeled over and died after the first 3 years in government if I hadn't been. But so I thought, I said, look, this can happen. And he said, if I can do anything for you, and so on. So we let it go. And completely unknown at the time, but about 3 years later, I showed up in charge of South Asia, as director for South Asia. At that point, the NSC was very small, the National Security Council, so my portfolio was really huge. And it was an amazing office. There were 3 of us in there. Dennis Ross did the Middle East peace process. Bill Burns, who's now the Deputy Secretary of State, did the Gulf area, and I did South Asia. So it was quite an extraordinary time in my professional life. And there was something happening, the president wanted done, and the interagency process would go back and forth. And finally I said, is there one person who could unlock this? And they said, oh, you'll never get in to see him. So I said, who is it? So finally somebody looked and they told me who it was. And I said, bulb went on. I said, he owes me one. So I made an appointment, and they, of course, if you work for the president, you do get appointments. So they gave the appointment without knowing who it was. So I went and marched in there, and he looked at me. He was a little kind of startled, and I said, remember, General, you said to me, and he said, yes. I said, well, I've come to collect. He said, what can I do for you? So I told him, and he sat down, and he said, that's too much. I said, but what you did was pretty bad. He did it. I came back, and that was my high point in that day, because, if you look at the glass as half full, you sometimes get, with a little bit of humor helps if you're constantly complaining about the half empty. But that doesn't mean that, there isn't a time when people, I remember telling somebody, I'd just come back from some talks, and someone introduced me and said, well, Shireen was just in Pakistan. No, I met him at the ambassador's in Islamabad. And she introduced me and said, she's just here for this day and she's at the White House. And he looked at me and said, at our White House? So clearly that sort of, especially since it was in Islamabad, it sort of threw the poor man. So those things happen, but that's part of the thing. Discrimination against women of course, look, there are people who say the way if depends on who's doing the discriminating. I mean, if you're talking about the Taliban types, essentially, I mean, within the four walls of their house, people claim that they treat their women with respect. Fortunately for me, I've never lived within the walls of their house. So I would not want to test that theory. But, I mean, people will say to you, well, paradise lies under the feet of the mother, not the father, which it means that the religion has put the mother in a very exalted place. But that doesn't stop people from then pointing out that when assets are divided or when testimony is taken, the male counts for twice as much. And that's very difficult for Western or any minds. People say, what is that? Does it begin there? So there are those kinds of things. Of course, there's always the final one, a Muslim is allowed to marry 4 times. They forget the context in which that occurred at the time it was said that a Muslim man could marry. And there are provisos in there that you treat them equally in both your treasure as well as your affection, which I'm fortunately not a man, but be very hard to do exactly. So they forget that part, and then, you have the people who sort of go, I mean, it's not even the trophy wife, I guess, whatever the word is, but so there are institutional handicaps, and then there are familial handicaps, and there are economic handicaps. If a woman doesn't have a capacity to earn, or the hope of earning, it makes that discrimination so much more, poisonous. But look, when given half an opportunity, remember all the microfinance in Bangladesh that launched the capacity of women to change villages. I went to Bangladesh at one point when Grameen was doing all kinds of things, and I remember going to a village, and everybody was very excited and gathered around, and I said, what's going on? They said, well, I forget the lady's name. She's coming, and she brings the cell phones with which these people connect with their families, because, very often the male goes overseas to work, and the families are left behind, but they stay in touch because they send money and all of that. And so the once a week or once a month or however they could afford, they needed to speak to that person. There are no phones in the village. So let's call her Amina. Amina would arrive, and she'd have the cell phones, and they would speak, and then they would give her the money, and she would leave. So I thought, this is amazing. I mean, we'd gone for something else, and so we were sitting around having tea as usual. And suddenly I hear this pat, and this beautiful sari comes flying through the fields, and I'm thinking, this is Amina. She comes on a motorcycle. She has 18 or 19 cell phones from various bags. And she hands them out, and total trust, and they do the calls, and they tell her, or she has a way of keeping track, I guess, of how many. She calculates how much, and they pay her. They either also can do it via a credit card into her account. She has a special, some kind of a app, I guess it's called nowadays. So, I mean, and people said that she was the first one in her family who'd just gone to elementary school. But she clearly had a head for math. She found a little bit of money, and now she had a little group going, and they were doing all kinds of things. So, economic empowerment has a huge impact. And so that when you don't do that, that's, I think, the worst sort of discrimination. Because if you do all the other things, but you give a woman a chance to break away, then there's some hope. But then you have, of course, all kinds of horrific crimes like acid throwing and all those other human trafficking, but that's not exactly just a Muslim problem. It happens even in the US, so we can't talk about that. Sorry, long answer to whoever it was.
Could you comment on good Muslims and bad Muslims was the question asked. Fundamentalist Muslims, the hub of which is Saudi Arabia, is the main hub. And we close our eyes towards it. How come we, being the standard bearers of justice, not stand to it? And do you see any hope with Saudi Arabia being in power, the fundamentalism will go away?
I hope so. I think it's an issue that comes up. It comes up more often than you hear about. It does come up. I've sat in so many places where the level of frustration keeps going up. But you know, the thing is, what's surprising to me is that the level of frustration in the societies which are most affected by the export of Wahhabi ideology, that there isn't a reaction. And there isn't a reaction, I think, because all those mullahs and mosques have been funded by them. So they've got a hold on the uneducated masses. You talk to somebody who's had a little bit of education, and they will begin to say, wait a minute, this is not the way it is. But because of the keeper of the holy places, people say you can't even ask if they're doing terrible things. But I do think, look, I mean, 20 years ago, you and I wouldn't be raising this issue. We wouldn't have thought about it. So I have to believe that, you know, this will happen, but it's not going to happen very fast because, you know, as they say, money speaks, and a lot of money speaks even louder. But countries will have to take responsibility. Countries in the Muslim world will have to take responsibility for this to change. You don't find that sort of attitude in America. The American Muslims aren't running around promoting Wahhabism as far as I know. If they are, then... But they are not the only ones. Yeah, but they're not the only ones, because many of us stand up and say, excuse me, I don't think you speak for me. But until it begins to happen elsewhere, it's very hard to see it happening, because no country from outside, and certainly a Western country, and certainly a country with sort of the baggage that the United States carries, is going to get in that fight. Nor would I say to any incoming or continuing president, this is the fight you need to pick now, publicly. But I think we need to start focusing on it privately. There was a hand up here somewhere on this side? No. Okay.
I'd like to welcome you, Madam Ambassador, over here.
Oh, hi.
Welcome from Kendall College of Art and Design. Could you please comment on the theology behind a situation I will describe? In a small town south of here, there is an enclave of Muslims. They have a nice community. Some of the women in that community wear burqas, and they may not go outside of the house without their male escort. And obviously, I have no understanding of this. Could you help me understand what part of the Muslim theology dictates to them to live this way?
I think you have an expert back there. Would you like to, sir, take this on? No. You know, Islam asks a woman to be modest. Modesty is a very far cry from just having, you know, your pupils showing, in my book, and a lot of people's idea. There's a certain code of behavior which is not uncommon to most faiths. I think it's a global phenomenon that there is greater orthodoxy, there is greater sort of insularity, which is hard for those of us who don't practice it to understand. I have been sometimes to events where sort of the women are separated and so on. And when these women throw off their burqas or their hijab or whatever they happen to be wearing, they are you can't tell that they're any different. They're fairly what we call with it. But that's what they have chosen. Some, the younger one who'd have taken it on, sort of always surprises me, but some of them say, look, we're considered the bad guy, so we might as well stand up and show the flag. And then I say, well, where did you get this flag from? Who tells you? Well, my husband, my brother, my father, my whoever, you know, or I did it. I mean, sometimes and there have been cases where the girls themselves have, and the parents are beside themselves saying, why? And they said, well, you know, this is how we want to identify ourselves. So I find it hard to follow the practice, but I don't connect it with my religion. But I also sort of become very worried about the confrontation that comes from the sort of the frontal attack, like the French rule now. You know, the new law that the National Assembly of France passed, whereby if you're wearing a burqa or I think there's a certain percentage they allow. I don't know how they figure it out, and most French policemen, I don't know how they go measure how much percentage is covered. But and then they fine you, and the second time the fine doubles, and the third time the husband or the male guardian gets fined, apparently. And so they're finding that the third time they have some impact, because a fellow has to cough up some money. That, okay, put your money where your mouth is, sort of a thing. But I think it's become a part of the cultural confrontation more than a religious. It's this sort of separation that is now often sought, which is a very far cry from, you know, the world that most of us wish would happen. But insularity has become, you know, was search for sort of purity in our own midst, kind of a thing. It's not only a Muslim thing, but it's, of course, because 1.7 billion Muslims is a large number, it shows up more.
Madam Ambassador,
yes.
I wonder if you might speak to U.S. government programs of outreach to Muslim women, whether public diplomacy, educational exchanges, women's literacy programs, things of that sort, please.
Whether they're continuing, or do they make a difference? I didn't catch the last part of you.
If you could describe such programs and any policy recommendations you might have for improvement.
They were sort of, you know, we went through, as you know, this very public phase of promoting them, putting money in them through the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Republican Institute, directly through democracy promotion, through education, working with NGOs and civil society. So a lot of them were in place. Many of them are continuing because the State Department, I mean, Hillary Clinton, if she's anything, she has got a sense of what women need. So the focus has shifted a little bit, as you would imagine. Some of them, the ones that were started previously, have sort of withered away. Some new ones have come, and some have continued. It was very interesting. One of the comments that Condi Rice made when she was leaving, in the first meeting, you know, the sign-off to the new Secretary of State was, well, we built on what you did for women's empowerment. I know this because that was part of that was my last portfolio in government. And we hope you will build on ours. And Clinton was extremely touched because she said, nobody ever says I did anything good. So, you know, but it's the one area where there has been continuity. My successor at the State Department, I work with. We bounce ideas off each other. Sometimes she listens. Most often she probably says, oh my God, you know, here she is again. But, you know, they're doing a lot of things, but they're doing it through slightly different channels, through different resources. So I think that the focus has to change because the imprint, I mean, doesn't matter the policy is good for the United States as much as it is for those women. The other thing is that people have found in a very dark, depressing world when they reach out with resources to women in the Muslim world, and they find from a Sheikha Moza to Sheikha Lubna to, the doctors who work in the hospitals, I helped, thought about, worked through all the warriors in building the first cancer hospital for children in Iraq. That's why I was telling somebody I have been jumping out of Black Hawks in the hot desert sun, because that's the only way you could get down there in the sandstorms. But when you find the women there, looking after the children in terrible conditions, trying to help and so on, and then you give them a little bit of help, there's a dialogue that opens up that is amazing. I remember so many times, and I'd say, this is a person people need to talk to because she has an on-the-ground understanding of what works and what doesn't work, which we don't always have. We may have good intentions and maybe even resources, but if you don't understand what works, then we waste a lot of time and money. And it was like if you found a woman who had ideas, who was articulate, the doors that open up in Washington is amazing. And that's where we have our little, and there's a word in one of the language I know a little bit about, biradari, because there's a female network which I think is getting stronger. I mean, and more people are not just talking about things, they're putting money in. There's this Women in the World Foundation that Tina Brown and others, Angelina Jolie and others started. It's amazing. It's called Problems and Solutions. They've matched up resources with this incredible female doctor in Somalia who has nurtured Health for Girls, educated the men against female genital mutilation. I mean, it's just put needs and resources together. So women are practical and multitaskers because we just have to be. And it's beginning to, it's a very huge problem, but I'm hopeful that all these people with the right attitudes and so on, with this Malala Yousafzai issue, Angelina Jolie put down a chunk of money and said more is forthcoming, and let's do it for girls' education in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It doesn't mean that problems will be solved, but at least there'll be some resources to try to do it. And there are plenty of people, Pakistani women, Afghan women, who want to do it. Because remember the stories we heard about the first Afghan election, the women who were walking through minefields carrying their daughters 30, 40 miles to go vote? I mean, it was not a manufactured story. I've met some of those women, and they said, we did it for our daughters. We don't want them to grow up like us. So, on that cheerful note, there was a question here.
Ambassador, we spoke earlier, and you brought the subject up briefly in regards to human trafficking. So I preface my thoughts by some knowledge from my brother who led a 12-year study for the State Department as well as the United Nations on human trafficking. And this was extensive throughout the world in order to try and quantify the issue. And basically, there's 100 million people a year that are subject to being victimized. And they quantify something in the neighborhood of about 27 million a year that are actually victimized. Considering that half of that is women or more, and considering that a quarter of the world's population is Muslim, as well as these reports were given to the United Nations, which you've played a role in, as well as you're in the State Department. I've got 10 questions, so I'm going to just ask if you would just give us a little more perspective in terms of what you see with hope and possibilities of improvement of human beings, and particularly women, being victimized throughout the world. And it's not all prostitution, it's enslaved labor, et cetera. So just your thoughts in terms of your perspective from the State Department.
I think that it was a very, very important thing that in 2005 at the UN General Assembly, the President of the United States talked about this issue for the first time and called it the modern day slavery. It was necessary to do because we were discussing it even before, but it was just considered too private an issue. It isn't. It isn't private for the people who get trafficked. And there have been several ways in which this has been addressed. At the multilateral level, because this is a multilateral problem, traffickers don't know any boundaries. They're not national state actors. They move across with impunity. So you've got to have an international effort to, through the UN, through the police institutions, through any number of ways in which you can do it, to set up a network of education, of interdiction, of rehabilitation. In addition to that, the United States government set up, and Congress was very involved in this, and I think that's why it sort of took off, because it put the resources in, it kept its visibility up, a special office to monitor trafficking. And the State Department puts out, and I'm pretty sure that it continues to do that to this day, an annual report on human trafficking. And you know, people used to say, oh, well, it's the name and shame game, who cares? But I remember being in Greece on a bilateral visit. I'd gone there for Dr. Rice for something, and she wasn't able to go. And there, 2/3 of every meeting were taken up on this issue because the US was about to name Greece as the Tier 3 country, which means the laws are bad and they're doing nothing. One is if everything is hunky-dory. Two, if at least you're trying, things are bad, but you're trying. When you go on 3, certain economic sanctions kick in, because Congress has been very much involved in all of this. So they, and of course, I mean, you know, NATO, this, that, they were up in arms saying, what are you doing? And we said, well, sorry, I mean, what are you doing? In order to get you off this hook, you have said you've started an educational program. What is it? Where is it? And so it helped focus them in a way that just simply passing resolutions would not have done, because it really came down to an economic kind of a sanctioning, and on an issue that nobody thought was very important. I mean, you know, wars aren't started over trafficking. But in some ways, the fact that this is a global problem, it's not an East-West problem, it's not a Muslim, non-Muslim problem, it's a global problem. It actually helps cut through the sensitivities and some of the nervousness, because we all have such problems. So there is a sense of why we need to do it. What are the best practices? What can I, a developed country, learn from you? What has worked? What hasn't? Why? So the discussions that have occurred, and it's often on the agenda of the women's empowerment meetings, and I've been in some of them, not certainly all of them, and certainly not in the last 4 years, but still, I can't imagine that has changed, is a very rich menu of discussion. And the great thing is, and with all due respect to the gentleman present here, it's when the women have got together, it's non-polemical. It has not been, who are you to tell me, and you know, and people getting on their grand speaking engagements. It has been, tell me what works. Here's my problem. Tell me what I can do, and here's what I can't do. And they're pretty upfront about that too, unless here are the things that need to change. So it's a very, I think, it's a rich conversation. It is far from resolved. It's awful. I mean, the numbers are horrific. I think the highlighting of this problem by a number of well-known people, including Christoph from Washington Post, has done extraordinary work, he and his wife, on this issue. But there are many others, has made a big difference, because the power of the media to highlight and to educate, and then accountability. Because, you know, sometimes they come up with names of people who are big shots, and then you find out that, you know, there's a side to them that nobody knew. There the name and shame works. And if it saves the quality of lives, why not? So you had your hand up a couple of times. Yes.
We have time for this one last question. I think it's over.
Yes, Madam Ambassador, you talked about the politically correct attitude that seems to be since 9/11 of anti-Muslim in this country. What is the role of our government, our State Department, in changing that? It seems that most of the instances or images we see are negative of the Muslim society. That needs to be changed. Whose responsibility is it? Because it doesn't seem to be that the media is doing that.
No, you know, it's a very good question, because basically it was, you know, the events that have changed American minds from neutral to negative in the Muslim world have been events that have happened in the Muslim world. So I think it's difficult to say that it is, you know, somebody's out to get people, because firstly it was the hostages in Iran, and people had just sort of, that was fading, and then came 9/11. In between it, there were also, I mean, because there's a certain level of prejudice that existed. And I don't think you can, in this day and age, where everybody's everything is out there in public 24/7, there's any need or any possibility of changing a bad event into a, you know, media good event. You can't do that. But the problem, I think, and the possibility that I sort of wanted to focus you on is that, and that's why I sort of went through the litany, one can look at bad things done by bad, loosely used, people we don't like, people we don't agree with, maybe we like but we don't agree with, in any society. But when that becomes the sort of the filter for how you view an entire religion, that is wrong. And the reason it has been okay to do it apropos of Muslims is because Muslims provided the context. So they're not blameless. So people say, well, what do you expect? And it'll take some years, I mean, for the Muslims to work through their own sort of, you know, salvation, sort of political, some kind of a political truce internally in countries, the balance between the sort of extremist forces and the moderate, those who want women educated, those who don't want. Those are very huge societal, tribal, religious issues. So we are probably condemned to be sort of witnesses to this turmoil, and then we pick and choose sides and say, well, you know, I saw 3 such events, and that must mean all 1.7 billion people are basically useless. I mean, we're an educated population. We're not uneducated mullahs. So I expect a little bit more, okay, bad things are happening, but against all of that, there appears a Malala Yousaf, despite all of that. There's got to be some good in that society. You know, we've got to become a little more nuanced. And it's sort of difficult without being willing to be nuanced, not to sort of, you know, condemn everybody as just being not worthy of attention or respect. Because, I mean, I was taught that and hopefully have lived by that you have to respect every religion, and you just have to. You may disagree with certain parts of, and which person doesn't disagree with some parts of some religion? But that's fundamental. People's beliefs are fundamental. One shouldn't go after that. Now the practice, and if people are doing bad things in the name of religion, I'm the first one to say, no, this is, you know, this is not on. So maybe one holds an educated population to a higher standard because it's been exposed to the world, it's been the superpower of the world, it's the only superpower of the world, and you know, Morning in America and all the rhetoric that we hear. I mean, I've lived and worked pretty close to some of it. And so you begin to think, well, you know, we should expect more from our leaders and ourselves, because you can't condemn any religion, as being worthy of humiliating. It's just not, I mean, at least that's again runs against the grain of my life, so I probably carried on too long on it. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be with you. Appreciated it.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have a gift of Michigan jams for you, but we're going to send them to your home because it might be a national security issue in your carry-on. So
if they're more than 3 ounces, yes.
yes, so they'll be sent to your home in
thank you so
Philadelphia.
much. Then I should think about it as we sit in the snow and pretend I'm in Michigan.
We'll be sitting in the snow as well. We would like to invite all of you to join us in a reception in honor of the ambassador. We're just in the room across the way here for a small refreshment, a chance to talk to Ambassador, to hear Kelly a little bit more and talk to one another as well. We hope that you will come to our final lecture, which is next week, the same time, Thursday at 7 p.m. We will be in Upper Donley, so that's just across the way here, Upper Donley Hall, and that will be Understanding the U.S.-Afghanistan Relationship. So that's the final lecture in the series. And again, thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. Oh, sorry, one more thing.
Thank you for your national audience.
Oh, yes, and thank you to our national audience. Thank you. And there's a fantastic article, I think it is a very fiery article that the ambassador has written regarding the young woman, Malala. So that is linked on our website, worldmichigan.org. It's also, we put it on our Facebook. If you want to be friends with us on Facebook, you'll get articles like that. And it's worth reading. When I read it, I thought, this woman is upset, and she's passionate about this women's education, and so please do read that. It's a fantastic
I'm a
article.
Beneficiary of it, so I have to be passionate.
Very, very good. Yes, thank you to our national audience and those at Ferris, and please join us in the reception.
Thank you.